there is something fundamentally broken in the way we build today. In 1872, a survey was conducted on the Borgund Stave Church, a traditional wooden structure in Norway during one of the harshest winters in decades. Outside, the mercury had plunged to -31 degrees Fahrenheit. Snow lay several feet deep. The wind howled through the valley with enough force to shred a modern expedition tent. Yet inside this wooden church, built in 1180, with no HVAC system, no fiberglass insulation, and no double-paned windows, the temperature held steady at 46 degrees Fahrenheit. There was no fire burning, no external energy source. The structure itself, built from solid wood using methods we've largely abandoned, kept the temperature stable. Compare that to a modern American single-family home. Cut the heat when it's 14 degrees Fahrenheit outside. Within 6 hours, your indoor temperature drops below freezing. After 12 hours, your pipes burst. After 24 hours, the house is uninhabitable. What did builders 800 years ago know that we have forgotten? In the mountainous regions of Scandinavia, hundreds of log cabins built between the 13th and 17th centuries are still standing. These structures have survived for centuries. They've endured winters that would rot a modern stick-built house in weeks. And they achieved this with 3 things that are completely ignored in our modern international building code: thermal mass, absolute airtightness, and a heating strategy based not on constant energy consumption, but on strategic heat storage. These 3 principles worked as a complete system. No single trick, no miracle product. Just a physically sound concept that worked with nature, not against it. Today, we build against physics. We try to fight the cold with brute force energy, and we are losing. Before we dive deeper, drop a comment below. Have you ever dealt with a grid failure or blackout in winter? How long did your house stay warm? An hour? 6 hours? Or could you see your breath after 30 minutes? Let us know, because what you're about to learn will change how you look at every modern building. Let's rewind to 2010. A research team at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology ran an experiment. They took 2 identical structures, both roughly 430 square feet. The first was a reconstructed medieval log cabin built to 14th century specs. Solid logs, 12 inches in diameter, hand-hewn, joined with tongue and groove. No modern insulation, no vapor barrier, no pink fiberglass. The second was a modern prefabricated house, built to current stringent energy standards. Double insulation, R value of 25, vapor barriers, triple glazed windows. On paper, the modern house was miles ahead of the medieval one. Both were placed in the same valley. Outside temperature, -18 degrees Fahrenheit. Both were heated to a comfortable 68 degrees. Then they cut the power. The modern house plummeted to 36 degrees Fahrenheit within 9 hours. The log cabin, after 48 hours, the inside temperature was still 54 degrees. After 72 hours, 3 full days without heat, it was still sitting at 43 degrees, well above freezing. The modern house had become a life-threatening icebox, while the medieval cabin remained survivable. Why? A modern civil engineer might say that's impossible. The R value of the log cabin is only around 10. The modern house boasts an R 25. A higher R value means better insulation, so the modern house should win. But R value only measures heat transfer in a steady state. It completely ignores thermal mass, and thermal mass is the game changer. A 12-inch thick log wall of old-growth pine weighs about 80 pounds per linear foot. Wood has a high specific heat capacity, meaning it can bank enormous amounts of energy. When the cabin is heated, the wood absorbs that heat deep into its core. When the heat source stops, the wood slowly releases it back over hours and days. The modern house? The walls are a sandwich of 1/2-inch drywall, a plastic vapor barrier, fiberglass batting, and thin vinyl or wood siding. The whole assembly weighs maybe 10 pounds per linear foot. There is zero mass to store heat. The insulation slows down the heat loss, but it stores nothing. As soon as the furnace quits, the heat in the air bleeds out through tiny leaks and thermal bridges. And because modern stick framing has no thermal mass, there is no reservoir to recharge the room. Medieval builders understood this instinctively. They harvested trees that were at least 80 to 100 years old. Trees grow slowly in the frozen north. The growth rings are incredibly tight, often over 100 rings per inch. This makes the wood insanely dense and heavy. 1 cubic foot of old-growth pine weighs over 37 pounds. Modern plantation pine, maybe 28 pounds. That density is crucial. More mass means more storage. More storage means a longer thermal lag. It takes 12 to 18 hours for the outside cold to penetrate a 12-inch dense log wall. By then you've likely rebuilt your fire. The cabin acts like a thermal battery, smoothing out the temperature spikes. But mass alone isn't enough. You need absolute airtightness. Here lies the second secret. Despite all our Tyvek wraps and flashing tapes, modern homes leak like sieves. Blower door tests show that the average modern home has a cumulative leak equivalent to leaving a 20 by 20 inch window wide open. That is not an exaggeration. Add up every gap around your outlets, baseboards and windows, and that's the hole you're heating. When it's 5 below zero, cold air is pouring through that hole 24/7. Your furnace isn't fighting the walls, it's fighting an invisible open window. The log cabins didn't have this issue. The logs were joined using a scribe fit technique. Each log was custom cut to mirror the shape of the one below it. This took weeks. A single room could take months to frame. But the result was a wall with virtually zero airflow. Then came the chinking. The gaps were packed with sphagnum moss from the bogs. This moss can absorb 20 times its weight in water. When dried and compressed, it expands into every microscopic crevice. Over that, they applied a daub of clay mixed with animal hair, usually sheep or goat. The clay dries hard, creating an airtight seal, while the hair acts like rebar to prevent cracking. It's a breathable system. Vapor can escape, but drafts cannot enter. When researchers test these 600-year-old cabins today, many meet or exceed modern passive house airtightness standards. A hut built with an axe and moss is tighter than a suburban home built with high-tech composites. The third element is the heating strategy. This is where it gets interesting. We tend to think of old cabins having open fireplaces. But open fireplaces are thermal disasters. They suck massive amounts of warm indoor air and blast it up the chimney. A roaring open fire can actually make a house colder by creating negative pressure. Instead, the Scandinavians used masonry heaters, known as kakelung or soapstone stoves. These are massive units built of stone or brick weighing several tons. You burn a hot, fast fire once or twice a day. The combustion is complete and clean. But instead of the exhaust shooting straight out, it winds through a labyrinth of channels inside the stone mass. The gas transfers its heat to the stone before it ever reaches the chimney. By the time the smoke exits, it's barely warm. All that energy is trapped in the stone. This stone mass then radiates heat gently for 12 to 18 hours. The surface stays at around 140 to 175 degrees Fahrenheit. Hot enough to feel good, but safe to touch. You can lean against it. You can sleep on it. The heat is radiant, meaning it warms objects and people, not just the air. Radiant heat creates comfort at lower air temperatures. You can feel cozy in 60-degree air if you are near a 160-degree stone wall. A modern forced air system has to pump the air to 72 degrees to give you the same feeling. That is a massive waste of energy. A Finnish study from 2003 reconstructed a traditional smoke room, an early cabin style, and tested it at -13 degrees Fahrenheit. A single 2-hour fire using about 45 pounds of wood kept the interior above 59 degrees for over 16 hours. The fuel consumption was about 1/10 of what a modern home with an oil furnace would burn in the same period. And that's without modern insulation. Just thermal mass, air tightness, and radiant heat. Interior design played a huge role too. Scandinavian cabins didn't do open concept. Modern open floor plans are a nightmare for efficiency. Warm air rises and gets trapped in vaulted ceilings while your feet freeze. Medieval cabins had low ceilings, often just 6.5 feet high. Rooms were small and compartmented by doors. This kept the heat where the people were. The central room for cooking and working was the warmest. Bedrooms were cooler, but that didn't matter because you slept under heavy wool and furs. This thermal zoning slashed heating needs. There was no need to keep the guest room at 70 degrees. We have completely forgotten this logic in our quest for massive great rooms. Then there's the foundation. Modern US homes are often built on slab-on-grade concrete. Concrete is a thermal bridge. It sucks heat out of your house and dumps it into the frozen ground. Scandinavian cabins stood on stone piers that lifted the wood off the dirt. This created an air gap that acted as insulation. The floors were thick planks, often double-layered with sawdust or moss packed in between. This broke the thermal bridge. No heat bled into the earth. Every detail was designed to hoard heat. Why did we stop building this way? 3 reasons: speed, cost, and cheap oil. After World War II, we needed millions of houses fast. Scribing logs and hand-cutting joints took too long. Stick framing with 2x4s and plywood took weeks, not months. Labour was expensive, but materials needed to be cheap. Thin walls with batting were cheaper than solid timber. And then the energy boom. In the 50s and 60s, oil and gas were dirt cheap. Who cared if a house was inefficient? You just cranked the thermostat. We stopped building for resilience and started building for low upfront cost. We built houses that are on life support, dependent on a constant drip of electricity and gas. Cut the line and they die. But energy isn't cheap anymore. The grid is becoming unstable, and people are realizing their expensive homes are fragile. In Europe, specifically Germany, Austria, and Switzerland, there is a massive movement back to solid wood construction, mass timber. It's not nostalgia, it's physics. Architects are combining traditional log principles with modern tech, thick cross-laminated timber, CLT, walls, masonry heaters, and smart compact layouts. They are seeing massive drops in energy use. A well-built solid wood home can run on 1/3 of the energy of a conventional build. And if the power goes out, it stays livable for days. Science backs this up. A 2018 study by the University of Innsbruck tracked solid wood houses versus conventional builds over 5 years. The wood homes use 40% less heating energy in winter. In summer, they didn't even need AC because the thermal mass buffered the heat. Residents reported fewer drafts and a healthier environment. Wood naturally regulates humidity, absorbing moisture when it's damp and releasing it when it's dry. No mold, no dry air, no noisy humidifiers. And there is one more thing we rarely talk about: durability. A modern house starts dying the day it's finished. Vapor barriers rip, fiberglass settles, studs rot when water gets behind the siding. After 30 years, you're looking at major renovations. Scandinavian log cabins have stood for 600 years. As the wood settles in the first few years, the joints actually get tighter. A 50-year-old log home is often more efficient than a brand new one. It's an asset that appreciates in function, whereas modern builds depreciate immediately. If you are looking to build or renovate a home today that is resilient, efficient, and built to last, steal these principles. You don't have to live in a medieval hut, but you can use thermal mass. Look into mass timber or solid log construction. If you can't do solid wood walls, integrate stone mass inside. A masonry heater or a heavy stone fireplace surround can act as your thermal battery. Focus on air tightness, pay for a professional blower door test, and seal every leak. That is worth more than adding another layer of insulation. Design for compactness. Skip the cathedral ceilings if you care about efficiency. Lower ceilings and closable rooms keep the heat where you are. Use thermal zoning. Heat the living space. Let the bedrooms stay cool. And think long-term. A house that costs $50,000 more to build but saves you $100,000 in utilities and maintenance over 30 years is the smarter buy. Modern codes obsess over R-value and upfront cost. They completely ignore resilience and life cycle value. The Scandinavian farmer in his 14th century cabin wasn't primitive. He was a master of applied physics. He knew that heat needs mass. He knew air leakage is the enemy, not the cold itself. He knew radiant heat beats forced air. And he knew that working with nature beats fighting it with a furnace. We traded that wisdom for speed and cheap fossil fuels. Now that energy is expensive and the weather is getting wilder, we are paying the tab. You spend $300 on a high-tech synthetic jacket, yet you're shivering in 40-degree weather. Meanwhile, a medieval peasant in simple wool stayed warm through winters that hit minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. What's going on here? The problem isn't your expensive outer layer, it's what you're wearing underneath it. That cotton t-shirt is sabotaging your entire thermal system from within. Modern comfort has made our bodies weaker at generating natural heat, and we've forgotten the three-layer system that kept people alive in brutal conditions. Today we're diving into the science of why medieval clothing worked and why yours doesn't. Let's start with the biggest culprit in your closet. Cotton is a hydrophilic fiber, which means it loves water. When you sweat or get caught in light rain, cotton absorbs that moisture and holds onto it. But here's where it gets dangerous. Wet cotton collapses. Those tiny air pockets that provide insulation when the fabric is dry, they disappear under the weight of the water. The cotton fibers straighten out and lie flat against your skin. Now your base layer isn't insulating you anymore, it's actively conducting heat away from your body. This is why outdoor professionals have a saying, cotton kills. It's not hyperbole. Wet cotton can pull heat from your core for hours, leading to hypothermia even on seemingly mild days. Your expensive jacket becomes irrelevant when your base layer is working against you. But the problem goes deeper than just fabric choice. Modern humans live in what scientists call thermoneutral zones. We move from heated homes to climate-controlled cars to heated offices. Our bodies rarely experience non-life-threatening cold stress. This constant comfort has consequences. Our natural defenses against cold have atrophied. Medieval people had faster, stronger shivering responses. Their bodies were quicker to pull blood away from hands and feet to protect vital organs. They were physiologically tougher because their environment demanded it. Think about it. A medieval person lived with the seasons. They spent hours outdoors daily. Their homes were drafty, heated only by a single central hearth. Their bodies were constantly adapting to temperature changes. They were naturally cold acclimatized. We've traded that resilience for convenience. Central heating lets us make fatal clothing choices without immediate consequences. We can wear cotton jeans and thin hoodies in winter because we're never more than a few steps from artificial warmth. There's also a psychological factor. We choose clothes based on fashion and social signaling, not survival function. This is a luxury purchased by cheap fossil fuels. When heating a poorly built house costs just a few dollars a month, thermal efficiency doesn't matter. Medieval people couldn't afford this luxury. While their clothing was also a status symbol, the primary driver in winter was survival. A peasant's heavy wool tunic and a noble's fur-lined cloak were solving the same thermal problem, just with different materials. Making a fashionable but dysfunctional choice wasn't a style statement, it was potentially lethal. Modern homes prove this disconnect. During power outages, our houses drop 1 degree per hour. Within 12 hours in severe cold, they reach dangerous temperatures. We've built thermal houses of cards that collapse the moment we stop pumping energy into them. Compare this to surviving medieval structures in Scandinavia and Russia. During multi-day blizzards at minus 40 degrees, these buildings maintain livable temperatures with just 1 fire per day. Some stay above freezing for over 72 hours with no fire at all. The medieval approach wasn't primitive. It was sophisticated engineering that worked with physics, not against it. They understood something we've forgotten. Your body is a heating engine, but only if you give it the right tools. That cotton t-shirt under your high-tech jacket, it's not just failing to help. It's actively sabotaging your body's thermal system. Medieval people avoided this failure completely by building their clothing around materials that worked with their physiology. They had a saying, "Only lazy and stupid freeze." This wasn't cruel, it was practical wisdom. Survival wasn't random luck. It was skill, knowledge, and the right system working together. We don't have to guess about medieval clothing systems. The ice is giving up its secrets. Norway's Secrets of the Ice project has been recovering artifacts from melting glaciers for over a decade. These aren't museum pieces or artistic representations. They're actual garments worn by real people who survived in conditions that would kill us today. In 2019, researchers pulled a complete woven Viking mitten from a mountain pass. It had been preserved in ice for over 1,000 years. The construction is remarkable. Dense wool yarn, tightly woven, with a complex pattern that creates multiple layers of trapped air. This wasn't casual clothing. This was survival technology. They've also recovered complete Iron Age tunics. The weave patterns show sophisticated understanding of thermal physics. Multiple yarn weights in a single garment. Tight weaves at stress points for durability. Looser weaves in body areas to maximize air trapping. Every design choice served a thermal function. But the most telling evidence comes from medieval Russia. Historical records document winters when the Baltic Sea froze solid. Ships were trapped in ice from November through April. These weren't occasional cold snaps. They were sustained, brutal conditions colder than anything we experience today. Yet people didn't just survive, they thrived. Russian chronicles describe active trade, construction, and daily life continuing through these extreme winters. The key was their clothing system. Archaeological finds from medieval Russian sites reveal the three-layer approach in detail. Layer 1 was the linen chemise worn directly against the skin. This wasn't about insulation. This was about hygiene and moisture management. Medieval people understood something crucial. Their valuable wool layers were expensive and difficult to wash. The linen chemise served as a washable barrier, protecting the wool from body oils and sweat. But linen had another critical property. Unlike cotton, linen fibers have natural capillary action. When you sweat, linen pulls that moisture away from your skin without structural collapse. The fibers don't straighten and flatten like cotton does when wet. They maintain their structure and continue moving moisture outward. This is why linen was the foundation of the system. It kept the skin drier and the insulation layer cleaner. Medieval people could wear the same wool tunic for weeks or months because the linen underneath was doing the dirty work and getting washed regularly. Layer 2 was the wool tunic, the insulating engine of the entire system. This layer had one job: trap body heat. The genius was in the modular approach. Need more warmth? Add another wool layer. Medieval Russians would wear multiple rubakas, one over the other. Women might add an extra kirtle over their first one. The most sophisticated version was the gambeson, a quilted jacket stuffed with wool or linen tow. The quilted construction created dozens of individual air-trapping chambers. These chambers prevented the insulation from shifting or settling. Each quilted section maintained its loft independently. If one area compressed, the others continued insulating. This quilted design also distributed body heat evenly. Instead of hot spots and cold spots, the gambeson created a uniform thermal field around the torso. Modern sleeping bag manufacturers use the same principle with baffled construction. But here's what made wool the perfect insulation material. Each wool fiber has a three-dimensional crimp structure. Under a microscope, wool looks like tiny coiled springs. These springs create millions of stable air pockets within the yarn and fabric. Air is the actual insulator, not the fiber itself. When wool gets wet, those crimped fibers don't collapse like cotton. They maintain their springy structure and continue trapping air. This is the famous wool insulates when wet property that has saved countless lives. The crimp is nature's high loft technology. Layer 3 was the weather shield. Dense wool cloaks with natural lanolin coating. Fur-lined capes for the wealthy. Leather outer garments for wind protection. This layer's job was simple: block wind and shed precipitation before it could reach the insulation layer. Medieval hoods were particularly sophisticated. The Google and Chaperone weren't just hats. They were integrated thermal systems that covered the head, neck, and shoulders. They sealed the thermal chimney at the neck where rising body heat would otherwise escape. The complete system left 0 thermal bridges. Every gap was sealed against convective heat loss. Sleeves were designed to overlap with gloves or mittens. Tunics extended below the belt line to overlap with leg coverings. Hoods integrated with shoulder coverage. Medieval people understood that a thermal system is only as strong as its weakest point. One unsealed gap could compromise the entire envelope. They treated clothing construction like military engineering because for them, it was a matter of life and death. The system also breathed properly. While blocking air infiltration, it allowed moisture vapor to escape. The natural fibers created a vapor-permeable barrier. Sweat could evaporate and exit the system without allowing cold air to enter. This is why the medieval system worked in active conditions. A person could chop wood or walk long distances without overheating. The system managed moisture while maintaining insulation. Modern synthetic systems often trap vapor, creating a clammy microclimate that leads to rapid cooling when activity stops. The 3 layers work together like a sophisticated machine. The linen managed moisture and hygiene. The wool provided thermal mass and insulation. The outer shell blocked weather. Each layer enhanced the other's performance. Remove any one layer and the system's effectiveness dropped dramatically. This wasn't just clothing. It was wearable architecture designed by people who understood that thermal failure meant death. To understand why medieval clothing worked so well, we need to dive into the physics of the materials themselves. This isn't just historical curiosity, this is hard science that explains why natural fibers dominated cold weather survival for thousands of years. Let's start with wool's secret weapon, lanolin. This is the waxy substance that sheep naturally produce in their sebaceous glands. It's not actually a fat, despite being called wool fat. It's a complex mixture of sterile esters that serves as the sheep's built-in waterproofing system. Medieval people used wool that was unprocessed or only minimally processed. This means the lanolin was still coating the fibers. They were essentially wearing nature's version of Gore-Tex technology. Water would bead up and roll off their cloaks instead of soaking through. But lanolin does something even more sophisticated. While the surface of the wool fiber repels liquid water, the core of the fiber can absorb water vapor up to 30% of its weight. This creates a hygroscopic core with a hydrophobic surface. The wool pulls moisture vapor away from your skin's microclimate without feeling wet or clammy. This dual-action moisture management is impossible to replicate with synthetic materials. Modern DWR coatings wear off after repeated washing. Lanolin is part of the fiber structure itself. It's permanent, renewable, and completely natural. Now let's talk about the crimp structure that makes wool's insulation properties so remarkable. Under magnification, a wool fiber looks like a tiny helical spring. This 3-dimensional crimp creates millions of stable air pockets within the yarn. These aren't random gaps that collapse under pressure. They're engineered spaces maintained by the fiber's spring structure. When cotton gets wet, its straight fibers absorb water and collapse under the weight. The fabric becomes dense and loses all its insulating air pockets. When wool gets wet, those crimped fibers maintain their spring structure. They continue trapping insulating air even when thoroughly soaked. This is why wool's insulates when wet property isn't just marketing, it's physics. The crimp doesn't disappear when wet, it springs back when dried. This resilience meant medieval people could work in snow, get caught in rain, or sweat heavily without losing their thermal protection. Compare this to modern synthetic insulators. Polyester fleece and Primaloft are hydrophobic, meaning they don't absorb water at all. This makes them dry faster than wool, which sounds like an advantage. But they lack wool's sophisticated moisture management system. They either repel all moisture, creating a vapor barrier effect, or they wick it so aggressively that you feel clammy. Synthetics also fail the sustainability test that matters to anyone interested in traditional skills. They're petroleum-based, energy-intensive to produce, and they shed microplastics with every wash. These microplastics end up in waterways and food chains. Wool is renewable, biodegradable, and actually improves soil when it decomposes. There's also the fire safety factor that's crucial for anyone living close to nature. Wool is naturally flame resistant. It will char and self-extinguish when exposed to flame. Synthetic materials melt and stick to skin, causing severe burns. For people working around campfires, wood stoves, or oil lamps, this difference could be life or death. Medieval people also understood wool's antimicrobial properties. Wool can be worn for days or weeks without retaining body odor. The lanolin coating and the fiber structure itself resist bacterial growth. Synthetics, especially older generations, become unwearable after a single day of heavy use. The sustainability comparison reveals why natural fibers dominated for so long. A wool garment could last decades with proper care. It could be repaired, altered, and eventually composted. A synthetic garment might be lighter and dry faster, but it represents a permanent environmental cost. For medieval people, these weren't abstract considerations. They were practical necessities. They needed materials that worked reliably in extreme conditions, could be maintained with simple tools, and didn't depend on complex supply chains. The physics of natural fibers created a perfect storm of properties: water resistance, insulation when wet, moisture management, durability, repairability, and sustainability. No single synthetic material has replicated this complete package. This is why understanding material physics matters today. We're not just studying history. We're rediscovering why certain materials dominated human survival technology for millennia. If these medieval systems were so effective, why did we abandon them? The answer lies in three converging forces that prioritized speed and profit over thermal performance. The Industrial Revolution changed everything. Suddenly, manufacturing speed became more important than product quality. Scribe-fit construction took skilled craftsmen weeks to complete a single garment. Factory-produced clothing could be made in hours using unskilled labor. Cotton became king not because it was superior, but because it was profitable. Cotton plantations using enslaved labor made this inferior fiber cheaper than quality wool processing. Mill owners could produce cotton fabric at a fraction of wool's cost. The market chose economics over physics. Then came cheap fossil fuels. In the early 1900s, coal was abundant and inexpensive. Later, oil and natural gas became even cheaper. When you could heat a poorly built house for just a few dollars a month, thermal efficiency became irrelevant. Why invest in expensive wool clothing when you could just turn up the thermostat? The post-World War II building boom accelerated this disconnect. Millions of homes were needed fast. The construction methods that became standard were optimized for initial sale price, not lifetime operating costs. Developers could maximize profit by building cheap and letting homeowners pay the ongoing energy costs. Trade schools abandoned traditional knowledge. As industrial methods replaced artisan skills, the accumulated wisdom of generations simply died out. Schools stopped teaching fiber properties, traditional construction techniques, and thermal physics. The knowledge that kept people alive for thousands of years was discarded as obsolete. Marketing campaigns convinced consumers that synthetic high-tech materials surpassed natural alternatives in every metric. Better living through chemistry became the motto. Natural materials were portrayed as primitive, uncomfortable, and outdated. Synthetic became synonymous with progress. This knowledge didn't disappear everywhere. In rural Alaska, parts of Scandinavia, and remote regions of Russia, people still live in structures built using these traditional methods. They burn a fraction of the fuel their neighbors consume. They stay comfortable when power goes out. They maintain the knowledge the rest of us discarded. The irony is stark. The average American home uses about 90 million BTUs for heating yearly. We appear to have advanced, but we've actually regressed in thermal efficiency. Modern homes seem cheaper to build, but over a lifetime they're far more expensive to operate. A stick frame home in a cold climate might cost $3,000 to $5,000 yearly in heating bills. Over 30 years, that's $90,000 to $150,000. A well-built structure using traditional principles costs more upfront but operates at a fraction of those costs. The skills required for traditional construction exist in only a handful of practitioners. When the last generation that knew these methods dies, the knowledge dies with them. We're witnessing the extinction of survival wisdom that took millennia to develop. The medieval system used 15 million BTUs yearly, while modern approaches consume 90 million. The difference isn't just efficiency, it's understanding physics instead of fighting it. Look for 100% wool-based layers and avoid cotton completely in cold conditions. Build your thermal system using natural fibers that work with your body's heat generation, not against it. The knowledge still exists. We just have to choose to use it. Sometime in the early 10th century, a Persian geographer named Ibn Rushd crosses into the lands of the Slavs. He is cataloguing the peoples of the known world for a geographical encyclopedia he will call the Book of Precious Records. When he reaches the forest steppe zone of what is now Western Russia, he sees something he has never encountered before. The people live underground, not in caves, not in natural formations. They have dug rectangular pits into the earth, fitted them with pointed wooden roofs that resemble the peaks of Christian churches, and covered everything in soil until the dwellings disappear into the hillside. Inside, he finds stone stoves and families who seem entirely comfortable. He writes that the cold in their country is so severe that each of them digs a kind of cellar in the ground. He does not understand the physics behind what he is seeing. Neither did anyone else for another 1,000 years. The structure was called a zemlyanka, from the Russian word zemlya, meaning earth, and the engineering principles that made it work at -49 degrees Fahrenheit, -45 degrees Celsius, are only now being validated by modern building science. Today we are going to show you how these shelters were built, what made them work, and how 5 interlocking systems turned a hole in the ground into the most thermally efficient dwelling ever constructed without modern technology. Ibn Rushd was not the only outside observer to document these structures. An anonymous Persian manuscript from the same era described Slavic winter dwellings even more directly. The Slavs spend their winters in hollows and underground huts. These were not emergency shelters thrown together in a crisis. Archaeological evidence from Central and Eastern Europe, from modern-day Belarus, Ukraine, and southwestern Russia shows that semi-subterranean dwellings were the dominant residential form across the entire forest steppe zone from the 5th century through the 10th century. That is 500 years of continuous use. Half a millennium of families being born, raised, and dying of old age in homes carved into the earth. In 2005, archaeologists excavating a 9th century Slavic settlement near Novgorod counted 23 foundation pits in a single village. Everyone had been dug below ground level. Not because these people lacked the tools to build above the surface, not because they lacked timber. The surrounding forests stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. They dug because at -49 degrees Fahrenheit, -45 degrees Celsius, a house that sits on the surface of the earth is a death trap. To understand why, you need to understand one fact about soil temperature that changes everything about winter construction. At a depth of about 10 feet, 3 meters, the temperature of the ground stabilizes. It does not follow the seasons. Surface air in central Russia swings from 95 degrees Fahrenheit, 35 degrees Celsius, in July to -49 degrees Fahrenheit, -45 degrees Celsius in January, a range of 144 degrees. The soil at 10 feet, 3 meters absorbs it all and barely moves. Research published in Renewable and Sustainable Energy Reviews quantified this precisely. The temperature peaks of summer do not reach a depth of 10 feet, 3 meters, until 3 months after the surface peaks. The coldest surface temperatures in January do not arrive at that depth until April. The Earth does not merely insulate, it time-shifts temperature, smoothing out the brutal swings that destroy modern heating budgets. At depth, the ground temperature in the Russian forest zone stabilizes between roughly 39 and 43 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 and 6 degrees Celsius, winter and summer, year after year. Not warm, but not minus 45. That gap, over 90 degrees Fahrenheit, 50 degrees Celsius, between the surface air and the surrounding soil, is the difference between survival and death. And Russian peasants exploited it with nothing more than a shovel, an axe, and a knowledge of terrain that had been refined across centuries. The first decision in building a Zemlyanka was site selection, and it was the most important choice in the entire process. A Zemlyanka builder did not look for flat ground. He looked for a south-facing slope, ideally at an angle between 15 and 30 degrees, with the entrance oriented to the south or southeast. This single choice accomplished three things simultaneously. Digging into a hillside rather than straight down meant the slope itself did half the excavation work and created a natural drainage gradient that pulled groundwater and snowmelt away from the living space. The south-facing orientation captured passive solar heat through the entrance and any small window openings during the short winter days when every degree of warmth mattered. And the slope formed a natural windbreak against the dominant north and northwest winds that carry Siberian cold fronts across the steppe at speeds that strip heat from any exposed surface. The excavation created a rectangular pit, typically 10 to 13 feet, 3 to 4 meters, wide, and 13 to 20 feet, 4 to 6 meters long. Archaeological excavations of early Slavic semi-subterranean dwellings show foundation pits between 1 and 4 feet, 0.3 and 1.2 meters, deep, but full Zemlyanki built for Siberian conditions went much further, 5 to 6 feet, 1.5 to 1.8 meters below the surface. At that depth, a person standing inside could touch the ceiling. These homes were not spacious, they were warm, and in a climate where exposed skin freezes in under 20 minutes, warmth is the only measurement that counts. The walls were reinforced with logs, spruce, pine, or birch, stacked horizontally and notched at the corners using the same joinery techniques used for above-ground log construction across Russia. But the placement was fundamentally different. The log walls were set directly against the earthen pit walls, with packed clay or moss filling every gap between the timber and the soil. This created a double wall system. The inner log surface provided structural integrity and a dry, habitable interior face that could be sealed and maintained. The outer earth mass provided thermal storage capacity that no thickness of modern fiberglass or spray foam can replicate. The log wall kept the living space dry. The earth kept it warm. Two materials, two functions, one integrated system. Here is where the physics becomes remarkable. Soil has an R value of approximately 0.25 per inch. That sounds pathetic compared to modern rigid foam insulation, which runs about R5 per inch, 20 times higher. But R value only measures resistance to heat flow. It says nothing about thermal mass, which is the ability of a material to absorb heat, store it, and release it slowly over time. Thermal mass is the entire reason a Zemlyanka works. The surrounding earth acted as a battery. During the day, when the stove burned and body heat filled the small space, the earth walls absorbed the excess warmth and stored it deep in the soil mass. At night, when the fire died down, those same walls radiated stored heat back into the living space for hours. A modern stick-framed wall insulated to R19 resists heat transfer well, but it stores almost nothing. The moment the furnace shuts off, the temperature drops. A Zemlyanka surrounded by several feet of packed earth experienced temperature swings measured in fractions of a degree. The earth dampened everything. Put that into real numbers. A Zemlyanka at 5 feet, 1.5 meters of depth, sat in soil that never dropped below roughly 28 degrees Fahrenheit, -2 degrees Celsius, even when the air above was 43 degrees colder. The stove and the body heat of a family of 6, generating roughly 600 watts, only needed to push the interior temperature up by 27 to 36 degrees Fahrenheit, 15 to 20 degrees Celsius, not the 94 degrees, 52 degrees Celsius a surface house would require. That is the thermal advantage. The ground does most of the work before the fire is even lit. The roof was the most vulnerable point, and the builders treated it accordingly. A central ridge beam, supported by forked posts at each end of the pit, carried rafters that sloped down to the top of the earth walls. Over the rafters went overlapping layers of birch bark, nature's waterproof membrane. Birch bark contains suberin, a waxy lipid compound that makes it nearly impervious to water penetration. Scandinavian and Russian builders relied on birch bark for centuries because it does not rot, does not absorb water, and maintains its integrity for decades without maintenance. Over the birch bark went a thick layer of moss for additional insulation, then a final covering of sod or packed earth, 8 to 12 inches, 20 to 30 centimeters thick. The finished roof was an extension of the ground itself. From any distance, a zemlyanka looked like a low mound in the hillside with a timber door and a thin column of smoke rising from a small vent. It was not camouflaged on purpose. It was invisible because it was built from the landscape. The entrance was engineered as an airlock, though no one used that word for another 1,000 years. A sloped passageway led from the surface down into the main living space, with a timber door at the outer end and often a curtain or second barrier at the inner threshold. Cold air is denser than warm air. It sinks. Every time someone opened the outer door, the frigid air rushed in but pooled at the lowest point of the passageway instead of displacing the warm air inside the main room. The passage acted as a thermal trap, holding the cold air in a buffer zone that protected the living space. Modern passive house designers call this an entryway vestibule. They publish papers about it. Russian peasants dug one into every hillside 1,000 years ago. The stove completed the system. A Russian clay stove, the pechka, was not a fireplace. It was a masonry thermal mass heater built from clay bricks or rammed earth, with an internal labyrinth of flue channels that forced hot smoke to travel a long, winding path before reaching the chimney. That extended contact between hot gases and the masonry walls meant the stove absorbed 80 to 90% of the fire's heat energy before any exhaust left the building. A single firing of 45 to 60 minutes could heat the stove's thermal mass enough to radiate warmth for 12 to 24 hours. A modern open fireplace captures roughly 10 to 15% of the heat it produces. The rest goes straight up the chimney. Ibn Rushd described the Slavic method of heating stones until they were red hot, a practice that predates the developed pechka but follows the identical principle. Capture the heat in mass. Let the mass release it slowly. Do not waste energy fighting the air. Now combine these systems: earth walls absorbing and radiating heat, a stove that captures up to 90% of combustion energy and releases it over 24 hours. An airlock entrance that traps cold air before it reaches the living space. A birch bark and sod roof that seals moisture out while insulating from above. A south-facing orientation that captures every minute of winter sunlight. This was not one clever trick. It was 5 interlocking systems working simultaneously, and when they ran together, a zemlyanka family burned 1/4 to 1/3 of the firewood consumed by an equivalent above-ground log cabin in the same climate. That savings was not marginal. It was the difference between having enough fuel to last until April and running out in February. An Intech Open review of earth-sheltered housing confirmed that energy savings of 60 to 70% are achievable in temperate zones. with studies documenting up to 72% savings in extreme climates. The US Department of Energy has stated that earth-sheltered construction can reduce heating energy use by up to 80% compared to conventional buildings. So why did we stop building this way? 3 forces killed the Zemlyanka, and none of them had anything to do with thermal performance. The first was social stigma. As Russian society stratified, the visible height of your home became a measure of status. A Zemlyanka is invisible by design. It does not announce wealth. It does not rise above the tree line. In a culture increasingly organized around outward displays of prosperity, a home that disappeared into a hillside was an embarrassment. Not because it failed as shelter, but because it failed as a symbol. The second was government policy. By the 19th century, reform programs under the Russian Empire actively discouraged pit house construction. Sanitarians and urban planners associated underground living with disease, dampness, and backwardness, despite the fact that a well-built Zemlyanka was often drier than most above-ground peasant houses, thanks to its drainage design and the moisture-wicking properties of packed earth walls. The perception overpowered the physics. The third force was Soviet industrialization. The state needed speed and standardization. Repeatable floor plans that could be stamped across a continent in 5-year production cycles. A Zemlyanka is site-specific by nature, every one shaped by its slope, its soil, its orientation to the sun. You cannot mass-produce a structure that depends on reading the land, so the knowledge was abandoned in favor of precast concrete apartment blocks erected in months. Those same blocks were poured without adequate insulation. Soviet-era housing studies estimate that heat losses in residential buildings reached up to 66%. In Siberian cities, district heating systems consumed staggering amounts of natural gas just to keep interior walls above freezing. In January 2024, a failure in the main heating network in Novosibirsk sent entire neighborhoods into crisis. Pipes burst, steam erupted from the pavement, and families in concrete towers waited days for repairs in temperatures below -4 degrees Fahrenheit, -20 degrees Celsius. The knowledge did not vanish everywhere. In Yakutia, the coldest permanently inhabited region on Earth, the traditional Yakut balagan, a log structure buried under 24 to 28 inches, 60 to 70 centimeters of packed earth and plastered in a clay and cattle dung mixture, housed families through winters that routinely hit -58 degrees Fahrenheit, -50 degrees Celsius. Some had windows made from river ice, replaced 3 or 4 times per season. During the Second World War, Soviet soldiers built Zemlyanki by the thousands along the Eastern Front. Field shelters that could be constructed in hours and kept men alive in conditions that killed exposed troops overnight. And in Scandinavia and Russia today, experimental archaeology groups continue to build and test traditional semi-subterranean designs, confirming that the thermal principles hold up exactly as the builders intended. The average American household spends over $600 on natural gas heating per winter. In the Northeast, families using electricity pay nearly $1,400. Globally, buildings account for roughly 40% of total energy consumption, and space heating is the single largest component. We chose speed, height, and standardization over thermal performance. We traded a shelter that ran on physics for one that runs on infrastructure. And when the infrastructure fails, when the pipes burst on the wrong night in the wrong city, there is no fallback. No thermal mass storing yesterday's heat. No earth walls radiating warmth at 3 a.m. Just cold concrete and a repair crew that may or may not arrive before the pipes freeze. You do not need a hillside in Siberia to apply this. The core physics work everywhere winter exists. A south-facing slope, even a gentle one, with 3 feet, 1 meter, of earth cover over a waterproofed roof, transforms the thermal equation entirely. The earth becomes your insulation, your thermal battery, and your buffer against every temperature extreme the atmosphere throws at the surface. Modern earth-sheltered homes based on these principles save over $3,000 per year in energy costs according to university research, and the savings increase every time energy prices rise. The initial construction cost runs roughly 20% higher than conventional framing, but the annual energy savings offset that premium within a decade. After that, the savings are permanent. A Zemlyanka was not primitive. It was a passive heating system disguised as a hole in the ground. It ran on physics, cost nothing to operate, and never failed because a pipe burst or a grid went down. Russian peasants did not have R-value charts, energy modeling software, or building codes. What they had was a principle observed and passed down for 1,000 years. The ground stays warm when the air does not. Build into it. Let the earth do the work. And 500 years of unbroken use proved they were right. In a village house in the Vladimir region of Russia, there is a structure that takes up a quarter of the entire room. It rises from the floor like a clay mountain. Whitewashed and massive, it dominates everything around it. Step closer and you see an arched opening at waist height, blackened from centuries of fire. Above it, a flat platform covered in quilts. To the side, wooden shelves built right into the wall. This is a pechka. The word simply means stove in Russian. But calling it a stove is like calling a Swiss Army knife a blade. It misses the point entirely. The pechka weighed 2 tons. It occupied up to 1/3 of a peasant family's living space. It consumed 40 to 60 pounds of firewood per day during winter, and it kept entire families alive through winters where temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Celsius. That's -22 Fahrenheit. Russians cooked on the pechka. They slept on the pechka. They bathed inside the pechka. They gave birth on the pechka. They healed their sick on the pechka. And when death came, they laid out their dead beside it. For 500 years, from the 15th century until the mid-20th century, the pechka was the beating heart of Russian peasant life. Today, the traditional pechka has become a museum relic. The heating systems that replaced it use 10 times the energy. They last a fraction of the time, and they do exactly one job instead of a dozen. This is the story of the pechka, how Russian peasants built a single structure that solved heating, cooking, bathing, sleeping, and medicine all at once, using nothing but brick, clay, and fire. The labyrinth inside the brick. To understand what made the pechka work, you need to understand how it was built. The construction started with a foundation. In the oldest homes, builders used thick oak or pine logs. Later, they used fieldstone or broken bricks. This foundation had to be strong. Remember, this structure would weigh 4,000 pounds or more. On top of the foundation, masons built a hollow chamber called the podpechi. This was storage space for tools, the poker, the paddle for bread, the iron grips for moving pots. Nothing was wasted. Above this came the main body of the pechka. Builders used fire-resistant bricks for the combustion chamber, where temperatures exceeded 1,000 degrees Celsius, or 1,832 Fahrenheit during firing. The walls were thick, sometimes a foot or more of solid brick, clay, and mortar. But here is where the genius lived. Unlike a simple fireplace that sends most of its heat straight up the chimney, the pechka channeled smoke and hot gases through a labyrinth of passages. These passages wound back and forth through the brick structure, giving up their heat to the masonry before exiting through the flue. The US Department of Energy estimates that open fires operate at only 10 to 20% efficiency. The pechka achieved 80% or higher. The hearth itself, called the gorno or the crucible, was an arched chamber about 3 feet deep. The opening, called the mouth, faced outward. It could be rectangular or arched. Through this mouth, peasants placed their firewood and positioned their cooking pots. Above everything sat the lezhanka, the sleeping platform. This was a flat brick surface, roughly 6 feet long and 4 feet wide, positioned near the ceiling where warm air naturally collected. Peasants covered it with straw, quilts and bedding. The whole structure stood about 6 feet tall. In wealthy homes, the exterior was covered with decorative glazed tiles showing biblical scenes or folk patterns in blue, green and gold. In peasant homes, it was simply whitewashed with lime. When you walked into a traditional Russian izba, a log house, you could not miss the pechka. It was the first thing you saw. The room was built around it. How it shaped Russian life. Here is what most people miss about the pechka. It was not just a heating device, it was the organizing principle of peasant family life. The pechka sat at the center of the izba for a reason. When you entered a Russian peasant home, you found two sacred spaces arranged diagonally across from each other. In one corner sat the red corner, the beautiful corner, where Orthodox icons hung beneath an embroidered cloth. This was the spiritual center of the home. In the opposite corner sat the pechka. Russians called it Matushka Pechka, literally Little Mother Stove. While the icons connected the family to heaven, the pechka connected them to survival on earth. The sleeping platform on top belonged to specific people. The place on the pechka was reserved for the head of the household, usually the grandfather or the eldest man. This was the warmest spot in the house, and it carried status. Everyone else slept on the palati, wooden shelves built between the pechka and the walls at various heights. The closer to the pechka, the warmer and more honored your sleeping spot. Women's relationship with the pechka was different. They managed it. Every morning during the heating season, from October through April or May, the woman of the house fired the pechka. She fed it. She read its moods. A strong draft and red flames meant frost coming. A quiet fire with white flames meant a thaw was on the way. Children were allowed on the pechka only with adult permission and only for short periods. It was a treat, not a rite. There is a Russian proverb, to dance from the pechka. It means to start at the beginning, because when Russians built a new house, they designed the pechka first. Everything else, the walls, the windows, the door, was arranged around it. The pechka also held a spirit. Peasants believed the domovoi, a household guardian, lived behind or under the stove. This spirit protected the family if treated well. If angered, it caused mischief. When a family moved to a new home, they performed a ritual to invite the domovoi to follow them, carrying hot coals from the old pechka to the new one. The pechka appeared in every major Russian fairy tale. In At the Pike's Behest, the lazy hero Emelia refuses to leave his pechka until magic compels him. In The Magic Swan Geese, the pechka speaks to the heroine and hides children from danger inside its warm chamber. In the stories of Baba Yaga, the witch's giant pechka becomes a menacing presence where she threatens to bake intruders. These stories reflected reality. The pechka was big enough to hold people, and Russians used that space. The accidental engineering. The pechka was born from necessity, not theory. Peasants built massive brick stoves because Russia is brutally cold. Winter temperatures in central Russia average -10 to -20 degrees Celsius. That's 14 to -4 degrees Fahrenheit. In Siberia, it drops to -40. The heating season lasts 6 to 7 months. But by accident, Russian peasants created one of the most thermally efficient heating systems ever designed. Here's the physics. Brick, clay and stone are dense materials with high thermal mass. They absorb heat slowly and release it slowly. When you fire a pechka for 2 to 3 hours with 40 to 60 pounds of hardwood, the combustion chamber reaches 1000 degrees Celsius. But the outer surface stays safe to touch, around 50 to 80 degrees Celsius, because the heat spreads gradually through all that mass. Once you stop firing, that stored heat radiates outward for 18 to 24 hours. Some pechkas stayed warm for 48 hours after a single firing. The surface temperature of the sleeping platform stayed between 25 and 30 degrees Celsius. That's 77 to 86 degrees Fahrenheit all night long. Perfect sleeping temperature. Modern masonry heaters, based on Russian Pechka principles, deliver 250,000 to 300,000 British thermal units of heat from 40 to 50 pounds of wood. Compare that to a metal wood stove. You get quick heat, but it disappears the moment the fire dies. You have to keep feeding it all night. The Pechka needed firing twice a day at most. And here's what nobody tells you. The labyrinth of internal passages called the Borov served two purposes. First, they captured heat that would otherwise escape through the chimney. Second, they slowed down the cooling process. Some Pechkas included a layer of sand or pebbles between the inner fire chamber and the outer brick shell. This insulation prevented the surface from becoming dangerously hot while maximizing heat retention. Russian peasants did not know the term thermal mass. They did not calculate BTS. They knew something simpler. Fire the Pechka in the morning while cooking breakfast. Fire it again in the evening while cooking dinner. The cooking heat became the heating heat. No energy wasted. One system serving multiple purposes. The cooking method itself was distinctive. Russians called it tomlenia, which translates roughly as languishing. You placed food in cast iron pots, positioned them in the hearth using a long-handled fork called an ukvat, and let them cook slowly at steady temperature for hours. This is the same principle behind modern slow cookers, except the Pechka needed no electricity. Foods cooked in the Pechka developed unique flavors. Baked milk, called toplanoe moloko, turned golden brown and caramelized after hours in residual heat. Porridge cooked overnight emerged creamy and transformed. Bread developed a thick crust and stayed fresh for days. And then there was the bathing. Some Pechkas had hearths large enough for a grown man to fit inside. After firing, peasants would remove the coals and ashes, spread straw over the floor of the hearth, and place containers of heated water inside. Then they would crawl in. The walls were splashed with water or diluted kvass, a fermented bread drink, to create dense steam. The hearth entrance was sealed with a stove door. Inside this chamber, surrounded by radiant heat from every direction, peasants sweated and washed themselves. Children were put inside on a wooden paddle, the same paddle used for bread. The practice sounds alarming to modern ears, but consider, this was a sterile, consistently heated space. During winter, when going to a separate bathhouse meant exposure to extreme cold, the Pechka provided a safe alternative. Sick people were also placed inside the cooling hearth for treatment. The even, penetrating warmth was believed to help recovery. Premature infants were kept on the leżanka, where the gentle heat mimicked the warmth of the womb. During World War II, the Pechka's size served a darker purpose. In occupied territories, some people hid inside their stoves to escape Nazi soldiers. The chambers were large enough to conceal an adult. What destroyed it? If the Pechka was so effective, why did it disappear? Three forces converged. The first was the mid-19th century arrival of the Gollandka, the Dutch stove. These compact brick heating units took up far less space. You could not sleep on them or bathe inside them. But they were simpler to build, easier to maintain, and fit into smaller homes as Russian households became more compact. The second force was industrialization and urbanization. Starting in the late 1800s and accelerating through the Soviet era, Russians moved from villages to cities. Soviet apartment buildings, called Khrushchevkas, were designed for hundreds of families in standardized concrete units. There was no room for a 2-ton masonry structure that occupied a third of the living space. There was no chimney infrastructure. There was no firewood supply. Central heating systems replaced individual stoves. The Soviet state built massive coal-fired district heating plants that pumped hot water through networks of pipes to radiators in apartment buildings. By the 1960s and 1970s, most urban Russians had abandoned wood heat entirely. The third force was cultural. As Russia modernized, the pechka became a symbol of the backward peasant past the nation wanted to leave behind. Soviet ideology celebrated industrial progress. The pechka represented exactly what the new Soviet citizen was supposed to transcend: rural life, folk tradition, religious superstition, pre-industrial technology. Nobody preserved them. When old izbas were torn down, the pechkas went with them. The knowledge of how to build them stayed with aging craftsmen called pechniki, stove makers, who were not replaced when they died. The district heating systems that replaced pechkas require constant energy input. When the power fails, when the coal runs out, when the pumps break, the heat stops immediately. Modern systems have no thermal mass, no storage, no resilience. The pechka stored days of heat in its brick mass. If disaster struck, if supply lines were cut, if the household ran out of wood, the pechka would continue warming the family for 24 to 48 hours. You could not say that about a radiator connected to a distant boiler plant. The Soviet Union valued centralized control over individual resilience. The pechka represented self-sufficiency. The district heating system represented dependence on the state. By the late 20th century, traditional pechkas had vanished from cities entirely. Even in villages, the Dutch-style compact stoves dominated. The full-size pechka with its sleeping platform and bathing chamber became a memory, then a museum exhibit. But a few survived. At Ethnomir, an ethnographic park near the town of Borovsk in the Kaluga region, about 80 kilometers from Moscow, visitors can walk inside a full-scale Russian pechka. The Museum of Suzdal in the Vladimir region, the Museum of Wooden Architecture and Peasant Life, has collected 18th and 19th century wooden buildings from across the area. Inside the reconstructed peasant homes, traditional pechkas still stand. Visitors can see the palati shelves, the storage chambers, the whitewashed exteriors decorated with folk patterns. The town of Suzdal itself is a time capsule. With fewer than 10,000 residents, it was bypassed by Soviet industrialization. The historic architecture survived. Some families never stopped using traditional stoves. In remote villages across Russia, particularly in Siberia and the far north, functional pechkas still exist. One woman who grew up in Ukraine and Siberia recalled that her family's pechka stayed warm all night after cooking dinner at 5 p.m. No additional wood was needed. The whole house remained comfortable until morning, when baking bread reheated the structure for another day. Some Russians are bringing the pechka back. Modern versions, built by the few remaining pechniki who learned the craft, cost between 80,000 and 700,000 rubles, roughly $1,000 to $9,000. These are not museum replicas. People install them in country houses, light them, sleep on them, and cook in them. The thermal principles have not changed. Physics does not care about fashion. A 2-ton brick structure with internal labyrinth passages will absorb heat from a fire and release it slowly for 24 hours, whether that fire was lit in 1524 or 2024. Modern architects studying energy-efficient building sometimes rediscover the pechka. The concept of thermal mass, of burning fuel intensively for a short period and then radiating stored heat for extended periods, appears in contemporary masonry heater designs throughout Europe and North America. These designs trace their lineage directly to Russian, German, and Scandinavian traditions. The knowledge survived because a handful of people refused to let it die. For 500 years, the pechka solved a problem that modern engineering makes complicated. How do you keep a family alive through a Russian winter? The peasant answer was not a furnace and a separate stove, and a separate bed, and a separate bathtub, and a separate medical clinic. The answer was one structure that did everything. They had limited brick, so they built one massive structure instead of several small ones. They had limited firewood, so they designed a system that extracted 80% of the heat instead of 20%. They had limited space, so they stacked functions: the sleeping platform above the cooking chamber, the storage below the hearth, the bathing inside the cooling firebox. The thermal engineering, the labyrinth passages that captured escaping heat, the thick brick walls that absorbed and released energy slowly, the sleeping platform positioned in the warmest air. All of this matches what modern building scientists now recommend for energy-efficient homes. The peasants did not know the terminology. They knew the result: fire it twice a day and stay warm all winter. What disappeared was not the physics. The physics has not changed. What disappeared was a way of life organized around one central structure. Soviet apartments needed central heating. Modern houses need furnaces and stoves and beds and bathrooms as separate systems, each requiring its own energy, its own maintenance, its own cost. But a few pechkas still stand. At Ethnomir, you can step inside one. In Suzdal, you can see how peasants arrange their lives around them. In scattered villages, families still sleep on them, still cook in them, still feel the radiant warmth that their great-great-grandparents felt. The pechka was not primitive. It was a complete thermal system built without electricity, without fossil fuels, without any external dependency. It burned local wood and served every human need. We traded that for radiators connected to boiler plants we do not control. The choice was made for us. Picture a medieval castle. Stone walls 3 feet thick, no insulation. Windows that are basically holes in the wall. Outside temperature, -20 degrees Fahrenheit. Now picture your modern home. Insulated walls, double pane windows, central heating. Yet when the power goes out for 12 hours in winter, you're wearing 3 coats and can see your breath indoors. In 1347, the Great Hall of Warwick Castle maintained 65 degrees during England's coldest winter on record. No electricity, no furnace, no thermostat. The castle held hundreds of people comfortably warm while outside. People froze to death in their poorly built homes. How is this possible? What did medieval builders understand about heat that we've completely forgotten? Walk through a modern home under construction and you'll see what the building industry calls progress. 2x6 studs filled with R19 fiberglass insulation, vapor barriers, foam board sheathing, Tyvek wrap. The walls are designed to slow heat transfer. But here's what thermal imaging reveals. Your modern home is hemorrhaging heat at every penetration point, every outlet, every window frame, every door seal. The average new construction home has air leakage equivalent to a 3 foot by 3 foot hole in your living room wall. The fundamental problem is thermal mass, or the complete absence of it. Modern homes are built with materials that have almost zero heat storage capacity. Half-inch drywall, thin siding, hollow stud cavities. These materials slow heat movement, but they cannot store heat. The moment your furnace stops running, there is no reserve, no buffer. Just thin barriers between you and freezing temperatures outside. Modern construction has created complete dependence on active heating systems. Your home is essentially a tent with better wind protection. It requires continuous energy input to remain habitable. The statistics are brutal. During a winter power outage at 20 degrees Fahrenheit, the average modern home drops 1 degree every 40 minutes. Within 12 hours, you're at dangerous temperatures. Pipes freeze, families evacuate. Medieval castles? Records from Bodiam Castle in 1385 show that after extinguishing all fires at night, interior temperatures remained above 50 degrees for over 18 hours, even when outside temperatures dropped below freezing. No power required, no ongoing fuel consumption, just intelligent design working with the physics of heat. The foundation of medieval warmth was the walls themselves, not as barriers, but as batteries. Castle walls range from 8 to 15 feet thick. A single cubic foot of limestone weighs 165 pounds. A 10-foot section of castle wall contains approximately 12,000 pounds of stone. Stone has high thermal mass. It absorbs heat slowly and releases it slowly. During the day, fires, body heat, cooking, and even weak winter sun warm the stone. That heat soaks deep into the mass. At night, when external temperatures plummet, those walls radiate stored warmth back into interior spaces for hours. The thermal lag can exceed 24 hours. Medieval castles did not use fireplaces as we know them. The Great Hall featured a central open hearth positioned in the middle of the room. No chimney pulling heat straight up and out. Instead, smoke rose to the ceiling, spreading heat throughout the upper volume before venting through a louver or roof opening. This design was brutally efficient. Radiant heat spread in all directions. The stone floor absorbed heat from below. Wall-mounted braziers and portable charcoal heaters supplemented the main hearth, creating layered heat zones. The smoke itself carried heat into the upper spaces before escaping, warming the ceiling stones which then radiated downward. The architecture trapped and directed heat strategically. High ceilings allowed hot air and smoke to rise away from occupants while still transferring heat to stone overhead. Thick tapestries on walls did not just decorate, they created an insulating air gap between cold stone and living space. Galleries and upper floors benefited from rising heat, creating warmer sleeping areas above the main hall. Personal sleeping quarters were intentionally small. Bed chambers measured 10 by 12 feet, not for lack of space, but for heat retention. Smaller volumes require less energy to warm and hold heat longer. Four-poster beds with heavy curtains created micro-environments. Your body heat trapped inside the curtained enclosure could raise the temperature 10 to 15 degrees above the room. Add heated stones wrapped in cloth placed at the foot of the bed, and you had hours of warmth. Braziers were the medieval space heater. These metal vessels held charcoal, which burns hotter and cleaner than wood. Charcoal produces minimal smoke and consistent heat for hours. A well-made brazier could keep a small chamber at 60 degrees all night on a single load of coals. They were portable, safe when used correctly, and could be moved to wherever heat was needed most. Records from Westminster Palace in 1252 show an order for 120 braziers for winter use. This wasn't luxury, it was standard practice. Braziers allowed precision heating. Why warm an entire castle when you can warm the specific room you occupy? Not all stone is equal for thermal mass. Medieval builders preferred limestone and sandstone for interior walls. These stones have high specific heat capacity. They can absorb large amounts of thermal energy per pound. Limestone has a specific heat of 0.22 British thermal units per pound per degree Fahrenheit. Compare that to drywall at 0.26, but weighing a fraction as much. The mass multiplies the effect. Dense, fine-grained stone was selected for areas nearest living spaces. Coarser stone with air pockets was used for outer walls where insulation mattered more than heat storage. This layering created a gradient. Outer walls slowed heat loss, inner walls stored and radiated heat. Charcoal was the premium heating fuel. Making it was an art. Wood is slowly heated in low oxygen environments until volatile gases are driven off, leaving nearly pure carbon. The result burns at over 1100 degrees Fahrenheit with almost no smoke and minimal ash. 1 pound of quality charcoal provides twice the heat of 1 pound of wood and burns 3 times longer. For indoor heating where smoke control matters, charcoal was essential. Castle records show massive stockpiles. The Tower of London in 1285 stored over 50 tons of charcoal for winter heating. Tapestries were functional technology disguised as art. Thick woven wool, often layered multiple pieces deep, hung 6 to 12 inches away from stone walls. This created a dead air space, one of the best insulators available. The fabric also absorbed moisture, preventing condensation on cold stone, which would draw heat away. Modern testing of period-accurate tapestries shows they can reduce heat loss through walls by 30 to 40%. They also dampened sound and blocked drafts. A well-appointed hall with full tapestries could feel 10 degrees warmer than bare stone with the same heat input. The simplest heat storage technology: rocks. Smooth river stones or purpose-made bricks were heated in the hearth fire, then wrapped in cloth and placed in beds, under cloaks, or at writing desks. A 10-pound stone heated to 200 degrees and wrapped well will radiate useful warmth for 6 to 8 hours. This was universal technology. Rich and poor alike used heated stones. The difference was only in the wrapping material: silk for nobles, wool for commoners. But the physics worked the same for everyone. Medieval people did not heat their homes to modern comfort levels. They heated themselves. The strategy was layering. A fully dressed person in winter wore 7 to 8 layers: linen undertunic, wool shirt, padded gambeson, outer tunic, cloak, hood, gloves, and wool hose. Each layer trapped air, nature's best insulator. The materials mattered. Linen against skin, wicked moisture away. Wool provided insulation even when damp. Fur linings for the wealthy added another thermal barrier. A person dressed this way could remain comfortable in a 50-degree room, a temperature that would feel unbearable to us in a t-shirt and jeans. Privacy was a luxury few could afford, but communal sleeping was also practical thermal engineering. Entire families shared beds. Servants slept in groups. Body heat, multiplied by 4 to 6 people under heavy blankets in a curtained bed, could raise the internal temperature 20 degrees above the room. This wasn't just about warmth, it was survival. In the coldest months, isolated sleeping could mean death. Clustering was a heating strategy that required no fuel, no fire, just human biology and smart enclosure design. Medieval households structured daily activities around heat. Mornings began in the kitchen, where cooking fires had been running since dawn. Work that could be done indoors happened in the warmest rooms. Outdoor work was saved for midday when sun and activity kept bodies warm. Evenings centered on the great hall and its hearth. This was social, but also practical. One large fire warming many people is far more efficient than many small fires in separate rooms. Entertainment, dining, and socializing all happened where the heat was. At night, fires were banked, partially smothered to burn slowly, not extinguished. This preserved coals for easy rekindling and provided low-level heat for hours. Heated stones were refreshed from banked coals and placed in beds. Then came the layers: heavy wool blankets, fur coverings, and closed bed curtains sealing in warmth until morning. Building a castle with 10-foot thick stone walls required decades and enormous expense. The labour cost alone would bankrupt most projects today. A single skilled mason could lay approximately 30 cubic feet of stone per week. A modest castle required 300,000 cubic feet of stone. That's 10,000 weeks of mason labour, or 200 masons working for an entire year. Modern stick frame construction is optimised for speed and low initial cost. A crew of 6 can frame an entire house in 2 weeks. The walls go up in days, not decades. When construction speed and upfront cost are the priorities, thermal mass becomes impossible. You cannot build 8-foot thick walls quickly or cheaply. For most of the 20th century, energy was absurdly cheap. In the 1960s, heating a poorly insulated house cost $200 per year. When fuel is that inexpensive, there's no economic incentive to design for passive thermal performance. Just burn more fuel. Install a bigger furnace. The inefficiency doesn't matter if energy is nearly free. Today, that calculus has changed. The average American home spends $1,200 to $2,000 yearly on heating. As energy costs rise, the lifetime operating cost of a modern home far exceeds what it cost to build. A medieval castle required enormous upfront investment, but minimal ongoing fuel. A modern home appears cheap to build, but becomes a money pit over 30 to 50 years. Building codes and architectural education focus almost exclusively on R-value, thermal resistance through materials. There is virtually no discussion of thermal mass, heat storage, or passive systems. Engineers are trained to solve heating with active mechanical systems, not with building design. The few modern buildings that incorporate high thermal mass, rammed earth homes, concrete structures with passive solar design, perform remarkably well. They maintain stable temperatures with minimal heating and cooling. But this knowledge is considered alternative or niche, not mainstream practice. We've forgotten how to build for thermal performance without machines. Medieval systems were resilient. They worked during sieges, famines, and disasters. No supply chain, no grid dependency, just stone, fire, and knowledge. Modern homes are fragile. They are comfortable only as long as external systems function perfectly. When those systems fail, habitability collapses within hours. We're not guessing about medieval thermal performance. We have records. The household accounts of Westminster Palace from 1275 detail fuel consumption, room occupancy, and even complaints about cold. During the winter of 1309, one of the coldest on record, interior temperatures in occupied halls ranged from 58 to 68 degrees, with fires burning only 6 to 8 hours per day. Archaeological evidence confirms this. Excavations at Bodiam Castle revealed hearth designs, charcoal deposits, and even soot patterns on walls that tell us how heat moved through spaces. Analysis of wood consumption in storage records shows castles used far less fuel per square foot than modern homes, despite heating larger volumes. In 2003, a team in Scotland built an accurate 1:4 scale model of a medieval Great Hall using period techniques. They equipped it with sensors and subjected it to winter conditions. With a central hearth burning for 4 hours, then extinguished, interior temperature remained above 55 degrees for over 14 hours, while outside temperature was 25 degrees. Thermal imaging showed exactly what medieval builders understood intuitively. The stone walls absorbed massive amounts of heat during the burn, then released it slowly. The thickest sections of wall, nearest the hearth, remained warm to the touch for 18+ hours. The heat radiated inward, maintaining livable temperatures long after the fire died. When tested against a modern insulated structure of the same size, the results were startling. The modern structure heated faster, reaching target temperature in 45 minutes versus 2 hours for the stone structure. But when heat sources were removed, the modern structure lost heat catastrophically. Within 6 hours, it was within 5 degrees of outside temperature. The medieval structure lost heat gradually over 24 hours, creating a shallow, manageable decline. This thermal flywheel effect meant occupants had time to respond. You could let a fire go out overnight without waking to freezing conditions. In a modern home, that's impossible. The temperature crash is rapid and severe. You cannot build a castle, but you can incorporate thermal mass principles. Concrete floors with radiant heating store and release heat gradually. Interior brick or stone walls in main living areas act as thermal batteries. Even thick plaster over framing adds meaningful mass. Passive solar design pairs thermal mass with south-facing windows. Winter sun heats exposed concrete or tile floors during the day. At night, that stored heat radiates back into the space. This can reduce heating loads by 30 to 50% in the right climate. Medieval builders used weak winter sun the same way. Every bit of free heat mattered. The medieval practice of heating only occupied spaces makes economic sense today. Close off unused rooms. Lower the thermostat in bedrooms. Use small, efficient space heaters where you are. Instead of maintaining 70 degrees in 2,000 square feet, maintain 68 degrees in the 400 square feet you're actually using. Smaller, well-insulated spaces require far less energy. A 200 square foot bedroom with good insulation and a small heater uses a fraction of the energy of central heating an entire house. Medieval bedchambers were small for a reason: thermal efficiency. The easiest lesson: dress warmer indoors. Lowering your thermostat from 72 to 65 degrees can cut heating costs by 15%. Add a wool sweater and slippers, and 65 feels comfortable. Use heated blankets and mattress pads for sleeping. They use a fraction of the energy needed to heat an entire house overnight. Medieval people weren't tougher than us. They just adapted their clothing to their environment. We've been conditioned to expect tropical indoor temps in winter, which is neither necessary nor sustainable. Modern homes need resilience planning: a propane or kerosene heater that works without electricity, thermal curtains for windows, wool blankets rated for cold weather. Designate one small room as a warm refuge if power fails. Seal it well, add a safe backup heater, and store sleeping gear there. Medieval castles had inherent resilience because their heating systems didn't depend on external infrastructure. We can't fully replicate that, but we can reduce our fragility. The goal isn't to live like medieval people. It's to borrow their principles of thermal management, material choice, and strategic heating. Medieval castles stayed warm through a complete system: massive thermal mass storing heat, central hearths radiating efficiently, strategic architecture trapping and directing warmth, layered clothing and communal sleeping, and portable heat sources targeting specific needs. It wasn't one trick. It was integrated design that worked with physics, not against it. We abandoned these principles for speed and cheap construction, counting on endless cheap energy to compensate. As energy costs rise and grid reliability declines, the weaknesses of modern building are becoming painfully obvious. We traded resilience for convenience, and now we're paying for it every winter. You don't need a castle to apply these lessons. Add thermal mass where possible. Heat the space you occupy, not the whole house. Layer your clothing indoors. Plan for backup heating. Understand that insulation without mass is only half the solution. The knowledge medieval builders had still works. We've just forgotten how to use it. Your $300 bedding system is a scam. It's 3 a.m. A blizzard hits and the power goes out. Outside, it's minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit. Within 3 hours, your bedroom drops to 30 degrees. You're buried under 3 layers of blankets. You paid $300 for that memory foam mattress and another $200 for a weighted comforter. Yet you're shivering. Your expensive mattress feels like a block of ice against your back. You're sweating and freezing at the same time. Now imagine a medieval peasant in 1315. No electricity, no central heating. Outside temperature? Same minus 40. His bedroom, if you can call it that, is a drafty stone hall with gaps in the walls. Yet he's sleeping soundly under a pile of straw and wool. He'll wake up warm. You'll wake up hypothermic. What did a medieval farmer with literal garbage know that your $500 bedding system doesn't? Modern bedding was designed for one thing: a 72-degree room with the heat running. Cut the power, and your high-tech sleep system becomes a liability. It doesn't just stop working, it actively works against you. Today we're opening up the medieval bedroom. The secret to surviving extreme cold isn't in a mattress store. It's been buried in the 14th century this whole time. Let's start with what's underneath you. That memory foam mattress you paid $300 for is made from polyurethane, a fancy word for petroleum-based plastic mixed with chemicals called isocyanates. The entire purpose of memory foam is to be temperature sensitive. When it's warm, it softens and molds to your body. but memory foam works in exactly one temperature range, 65 to 75 degrees Fahrenheit. Stay in that zone and it feels like sleeping on a cloud. Drop below 65 degrees and the chemistry changes completely. The foam cells contract, the material hardens. Instead of soft cushioning, you're lying on a dense polymer block. Dense materials don't insulate, they conduct. Your body heat flows directly into the foam, which dumps that heat into the cold air around your bed. Your mattress transforms from a comfort layer into a heat sink. Take memory foam and put it in a freezer for an hour. Pull it out. It's hard as a rock. That's exactly what happens to your mattress when the temperature drops. The material you paid hundreds of dollars for stops being a bed and starts being a refrigerator shelf. But the mattress is only half the problem. Let's talk about your blankets. Every night your body loses about half a pint of water through your skin. That's not visible sweat, just water vapor. Invisible moisture that evaporates from your skin constantly, even when you're not hot. In a medieval wool blanket, this vapor gets absorbed into the fiber. Wool can hold up to 35% of its weight in moisture without feeling wet. The vapor disappears into the structure of the wool itself. In your polyester blanket, nothing happens. Polyester is hydrophobic. It repels water. That vapor can't enter the fiber, so it sits on the surface of the fabric right against your skin. As the room gets colder, that vapor hits what's called the dew point, the temperature where vapor turns into liquid water. Suddenly, you have actual liquid sweat sitting inside your blanket. And liquid water is a thermal conductor, 25 times better at moving heat than air. You've just created a wet layer between your skin and your blanket. That moisture is now pulling heat away from your body continuously. You get colder. Your body tries to warm up by sweating more. That makes more moisture, which makes you colder. This is the sweat-chill cycle. Your polyester blanket can't stop it because the material was never designed to manage moisture. It was designed to be cheap to manufacture and easy to wash. Modern bedding is built for logistics, not survival. That mattress came in a box because it could be vacuum sealed and shipped cheaply. Those blankets are polyester because polyester is made from oil, and oil is cheaper than raising sheep. The entire system is optimized for getting products from a factory to your door at the lowest cost possible. Thermal performance. That's your house's problem. As long as you keep the thermostat at 72 degrees, the bedding works fine. But the moment that climate control fails, you discover that you're sleeping in a plastic bag on top of a foam cooler. The medieval peasant didn't have this problem because he wasn't relying on his house to stay warm. He was relying on his bed. Walk into a medieval bedroom in northern England during the winter of 1315, the year the Thames River froze solid. You're standing in a stone hall. There's one fireplace in the main room, and it went out hours ago. The temperature inside is maybe 35 degrees. You can see your breath. In the corner sits what they called a great bed. It looks primitive, but every single element of this bed is solving a physics problem your $300 mattress ignores. The foundation is a palliasse, a thick sack stuffed with cereal straw, not hay, straw. The hollow stems left over after harvesting wheat or rye. This isn't just cheap padding, it's a thermal battery. Straw has what scientists call high specific heat. That means it takes a lot of energy to change its temperature. When you lie down on that straw mattress, your body heat soaks into the straw over the first hour of sleep. The straw absorbs that heat and holds on to it. Then, as the night gets colder and your body temperature drops slightly, the straw releases that stored heat back to you. It's the same principle as a brick fireplace. The brick heats up slowly, then radiates warmth for hours after the fire dies. The straw mattress is doing the same thing, smoothing out temperature swings. When you get into bed, it feels cool but not cold. 6 hours later, It's still warm because it's been holding your heat. Modern memory foam can't do this. It's designed to conform to your body, not store heat. The moment you stop generating warmth, the foam goes cold. On top of that sits a heavy wool blanket, a thick, dense 10-pound blanket made from sheep's wool that still has most of its natural lanolin, the waxy coating that makes wool water-resistant. Wool doesn't just trap air like modern insulation, it actively manages heat and moisture through a process called latent heat exchange. When water vapor from your skin touches the wool fiber, the vapor molecules bind to the protein structure of the wool. This binding releases a tiny amount of heat. It's called the heat absorption. Your blanket is generating warmth just by absorbing your moisture. Then as the air around you dries out or cools, the wool releases that moisture back into the air. Releasing moisture absorbs heat from the environment. This prevents your microclimate from getting too hot or too cold. The wool is self-regulating. It's not passive insulation, but an active climate control system. Medieval people didn't understand the chemistry, but they understood the result. A wool blanket kept you warm without making you sweat. A linen sheet over your skin stayed dry even though you were generating moisture all night. The system worked. The final piece was the canopy bed. Picture heavy wool or linen curtains hanging from a wooden frame around the entire bed. These curtains could be pulled closed on all four sides. This wasn't decoration. This was survival architecture. When you close those curtains, you create a small enclosed space, maybe 6 feet by 6 feet by 6 feet. Your body heat only has to warm this tiny pocket of air. And because the curtains block drafts, that warm air stays put. There's no convection, no cold air flowing in to replace the warm air you're generating. The air inside the canopy might be 60 degrees while the room is 35 degrees. That 25-degree difference is the entire secret. You're not trying to heat the room. You're creating a warm bubble around yourself. This is why canopy beds existed in every cold climate. Russian log cabins used them. Scandinavian farmhouses used them. Scottish castles used them. Anywhere humans faced brutal winters without modern heating, they built beds with curtains. The medieval system was a complete thermal package. Straw for thermal mass, wool for active moisture management, linen for skin comfort, heavy drapes to trap the warmth. Every layer had a job. Remove any piece and the system's performance dropped. Your modern bed has one layer, foam, and it only works if someone else is heating your room. Let's talk about why wool is different from every synthetic fiber ever made. When scientists analyze wool under a microscope, they find something remarkable. The surface of each fiber is covered in tiny overlapping scales, like shingles on a roof. These scales create millions of microscopic air pockets along the length of each strand. Air is one of the best insulators in nature. The more air you trap, the better you insulate. But that's not what makes wool special. Synthetic fleece traps air too. The magic happens when moisture enters the fiber. Wool is made of a protein called keratin, the same protein in your hair and fingernails. Keratin molecules have sites along their structure that attract water molecules. When water vapor touches a wool fiber, it doesn't just sit on the surface. It actually binds to the protein at a molecular level. This binding process is a chemical reaction, and like many chemical reactions, it releases energy in the form of heat. Not a lot of heat, maybe 1 or 2 degrees. But spread across 10 pounds of wool in a blanket, that adds up. Your blanket is generating warmth just by existing in a humid environment, which is exactly what happens when you sleep under it. Polyester can't do this. Polyester is a petroleum-based polymer. It has no protein structure. Water vapor has nothing to bind to, so polyester just repels the moisture, leaving it on your skin or in the air. Wool can absorb up to 35% of its dry weight in moisture vapor without feeling damp to your skin. A 10-pound wool blanket can hold 3.5 pounds of water in its vapor phase and still feel dry. Why does this matter? Because it prevents the phase change. The moment water vapor becomes liquid water, you have a problem. Liquid water conducts heat. But as long as the moisture stays in vapor form inside the fiber, it's thermally neutral. The wool is managing your moisture in the safest possible state. Modern synthetic blankets can't absorb moisture, so the vapor has nowhere to go except into the air or onto your skin. Once it condenses into liquid, you're in the sweat-chill cycle. There's one more property that separates wool from synthetics: thermal conductivity. This measures how easily heat flows through a material. Wool's thermal conductivity is incredibly low, around 0.035 watts per meter Kelvin. That's similar to fiberglass insulation used in houses. But when wool gets wet, its conductivity stays low. The fiber structure doesn't collapse. Those microscopic air pockets remain. Wet wool still insulates. Wet polyester? The conductivity skyrockets. The air pockets compress. Heat flows through the material much faster. Wet synthetic fabric is almost as conductive as wet cotton, which is why the saying, "cotton kills," exists in outdoor survival communities. Wool is the only natural fiber that maintains its insulating properties when saturated. Medieval people discovered this through trial and error over thousands of years. They didn't have lab equipment or thermal imaging, but they knew that wool kept you warm even in a rainstorm. They knew cotton and linen were fine for summer, but dangerous in winter. They knew that layering wool over straw over more wool created something that just worked night after night, winter after winter. Modern materials science is only now catching up to what shepherds knew in the Bronze Age. Natural fibers have properties that no synthetic has successfully replicated, not because we lack the technology, but because the chemistry of proteins and plant cellulose creates behaviors that petroleum-based polymers simply cannot match. So if wool and straw worked so well for thousands of years, why did we stop using them? 3 reasons: speed, cost, and oil. After World War II, everything changed. Millions of soldiers came home and needed houses. The construction industry had to build fast, and building fast meant using cheap materials. Wool mattresses were expensive. They required skilled craftsmen to stuff and sew. Straw palliasses had to be refilled every year as the straw compressed. But petroleum could be turned into foam in a factory. No sheep, no harvesting, no skilled labour. Just crude oil, some chemicals, and an assembly line. Memory foam wasn't invented until the 1960s by NASA, but by the 1980s it was everywhere. Not because it was better, but because it was scalable. Then came the marketing. Chemical companies like DuPont ran ads with the slogan, "Better living through chemistry." Synthetic fabrics were sold as modern, scientific, and superior. Natural fibers were portrayed as old-fashioned, hard to clean, and inconvenient. And for a while, it didn't matter that synthetics performed worse in extreme conditions, because homes had central heating. In the 1950s and 60s, natural gas was cheap. Oil was cheap. You could heat a poorly insulated house for $20 a month. Why invest in expensive wool blankets when you could just turn up the thermostat? This created what engineers call thermal fragility. We built an entire civilization that depends on constant energy input. Our houses leak heat. Our bedding can't compensate. And the moment that energy stops flowing, the system collapses. Medieval homes were thermally resilient. A house built with thick stone walls and small windows held heat naturally. A bed filled with straw and wool provided insulation even if the fire went out for days. These weren't luxuries. They were survival requirements in a world where energy was expensive and limited. We traded resilience for convenience, and now we're 3 generations deep into that trade. Most people under 40 have never experienced true cold. They've never had to survive a night without heating. Their bodies haven't adapted, their homes aren't built for it, and their bedding definitely isn't. The skills died out too. The last generation of master wool mattress makers is gone. The knowledge of how to properly thresh and store straw for bedding, nearly extinct. The understanding of how to build a canopy bed that actually seals and insulates, lost. We didn't just abandon the materials, we abandoned the entire knowledge system that made those materials work. But that knowledge didn't disappear everywhere. In rural Alaska, some homesteaders still use wool batting and straw. In parts of Scandinavia, traditional wooden box beds with heavy curtains are still maintained in old farmhouses. In Mongolia, herders use felt blankets made from compressed wool that have insulated their jers for centuries. These aren't museum pieces. These are working systems used by people who can't rely on a grid. And when researchers test these traditional systems against modern equivalents, the traditional systems consistently outperform in extreme cold. We didn't abandon wool because we invented something better. We abandoned wool because oil was cheaper. And now, 3 generations later, we've convinced ourselves that our $300 memory foam mattress is superior to what our great-grandparents slept on. You don't need to time travel to the 14th century to sleep warm without cranking the heat. You just need to understand what your bed is actually doing wrong and fix it. Step 1. Break the heat sink. If you have a memory foam mattress, you need a barrier between your body and that foam. Buy a wool mattress topper, not a synthetic wool blend. Pure 100% wool, 3 to 4 inches thick. This layer does 2 things. It stops your body heat from flowing directly into the foam, and it provides thermal mass that stores heat the way the medieval straw mattress did. You can find these online. Expect to pay $150 to $300 depending on size. Yes, that's expensive, but it's solving the core problem your mattress creates. If you can't afford wool, use a thick cotton or linen mattress pad. It's not as good, but it's better than lying directly on foam. Step 2. Replace your blankets. Get rid of polyester, fleece and synthetic Sherpa blankets. Buy one heavy wool blanket. Look for blankets that weigh at least 8 to 10 pounds. The weight matters because you want density. Density means more fibre per square inch, which means more air trapping and more moisture management. Wool blankets are expensive. A good £10 queen-size wool blanket costs $200 to $400, but you only need one. Medieval people didn't have closets full of blankets. They had 1 or 2 high-quality wool layers, and they lasted decades. If you can't afford new, find vintage wool blankets at estate sales or military surplus stores. Old military wool blankets are often better than new ones because they were made before cost-cutting ruined the fibre quality. Step 3. Create a microclimate. If your room gets genuinely cold at night, build a canopy. You don't need a 4-poster bed frame. Hang a curtain rod in a square around your bed. Use heavy fabric, wool, or thick cotton canvas. The goal is to create a sealed pocket of still air around your sleeping area. Close the curtains before bed. Your body heat will warm that small enclosed space. The temperature inside your canopy might be 15 to 20 degrees warmer than the room. That difference is survival. Step 4. Add a linen or cotton sheet between your skin and the wool. This isn't optional. Wool against bare skin can feel itchy and uncomfortable for some people. The linen layer wicks moisture away from your skin and transfers it to the wool where it can be managed properly. This is the same layering system medieval people used. Linen next to skin, wool over linen, heavy outer layer for wind protection. If you're on a budget, start with step 2. Replace your worst synthetic blankets with at least one natural fibre option. Then add the wool topper. Then add the canopy if you need it. The goal isn't to recreate a medieval bedroom perfectly. The goal is to understand the principles and apply them with modern access to materials. Here's what you'll notice. You'll sleep warmer with less heating. Your energy bills will drop. You'll wake up less during the night because the temperature swings will be smaller. And if the power does go out in a blizzard, you won't panic because your bed will still work. Medieval peasants weren't tougher than you. They didn't have magic genetics that made them immune to cold. They just had better tools. Tools that worked with their biology instead of against it. Tools that didn't depend on burning fossil fuels 24 hours a day. Your $300 memory foam mattress was designed for one purpose: to be cheap enough to ship in a box and soft enough that you'd buy it. It was never designed to keep you alive. The medieval straw and wool bed was designed by 10,000 years of human trial and error. People who used the wrong materials froze to death. People who used the right materials survived and passed that knowledge to their children. That knowledge is still available. You just have to be willing to learn from people who didn't have thermostats. If this made you rethink what's under your blankets, hit that like button and subscribe. We're digging up the survival knowledge that modern convenience buried. The medieval bedroom wasn't primitive. It was engineered. And that engineering still works today. Subscribe and let's keep uncovering what they don't want you to remember.